so excited to see we have so many folks with us. It is always an absolute pleasure for Cassie and I to speak with this group. We've done this a couple times a year for the past several years, and we're always really impressed by the questions that are raised and the ideas that you share, and we hope you'll do the same today. This webinar is going to be 90 minutes, and as always, Cassie and I tend to cram in information, and we tend to move quickly. I'm actually realizing that I wanted to turn on my camera real quickly just to say hello, even though we won't be keeping it this way. So hello to everyone out there. This is me, Tracy Fehrenbach. Cassie will turn on hers in a few minutes after a little bit. So I'll go through this first intro with my camera on, and then in order to save bandwidth, I'm going to go ahead and shut it off again to make sure that we don't have any problems or freeze up on you. So Karen said, like she said, we're going to have a few polls. We're going to have a few videos we're going to share with you today. As always, we strongly encourage you all to put your thoughts and your ideas in the chat box, and we will do our absolute best to pay attention to those and to respond to those. We're also asking that, and we're going to save everything that you put in the chat box. If there's anything that you're not comfortable putting in the chat box or you're still kind of formulating your ideas, we also encourage you to take some notes on the side. And the reason we do that is because this will be the first time that Cassie or I have ever engaged in kind of a follow-up discussion. So on October 28th, from 4 to 5 p.m., I believe it is, we're going to have more of a conversation about many of the topics that are raised in today's session. And in fact, Karen will be sending out a survey to you after the session today to get ideas about, how we'll spend that 60 minutes in a couple of weeks, if there are any questions or any particular topics that you want to hear us go more into. So please just put that in the back of your head as we move forward. We're not going to be taking a break today, so we just encourage you, as always, to take care of you. We understand that some of you are doing this from home, as are Cassie and I. So I'll give you a forewarning now. I have 2 young children in my home, and Cassie's got a couple of children on her end. And we're going to do our best to stay focused. But these days, we're just rolling with it. And as the title slide says, we're taking one step at a time, and we're accepting uncertainty with as much grace as possible. So I'm going to turn off my camera now, and then we're going to keep going with the slides. And when Cassie starts to talk, she's going to put her camera back on in just a little bit. So let me see if I can do this. There we go. Okay, I think that worked, hopefully. So Karen, I can control my slides. Is that right? Yes, look at that. Fantastic. Okay, so at the top there, the Center for Child Trauma Assessment Services and Interventions. This is where Cassie and I work. Cassie is the director, and I am the co-director of this center. In addition to working at this center at Northwestern University, both of us do a lot of other things on the side. We're both clinical psychologists, and we do a combination, of research and training, and I see some patients as well. But this work today is done through our center, and the purpose of our center is to serve as kind of a national center of expertise with regards to the developmental or the complex effects of trauma. And we are particularly focused on working with what we would call non-clinical providers in early education, child welfare, and juvenile justice setting. This work is made possible through funding from SAMHSA, which created the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. So that's the thing on the bottom of your slide there. For those of you that have not yet had a chance to become familiar with the NCTSN, we urge you to go to their webpage. There are a tremendous number of resources, many of which are for teachers, many of which are specific to early childhood. And just to check them out, because everything that's available there is absolutely free and meant to be used and to applied. So that is our push for it. A lot of the information that Cassie and I incorporated in today's session came directly from resources developed by the NCTSN. Moving right along. So this is just a minute more about our center that we have at Northwestern. These are the 4 areas of kind of services that we offer to folks. So as I said, we work with child welfare, juvenile justice, and early education. And specifically with regards to trauma-informed screening and assessment, we provide a variety of different sorts of trainings like this and consultations for people in those different settings. We also develop a wide range of resources, and we adapt some existing resources. In fact, there's one resource in particular. If you zoned out for a minute, because I'm talking quick, come back in now, because I want you to hear this. We will be developing, in collaboration with the Early Childhood Center, or with the center who's hosting this, a set of podcasts focused on trauma-informed work. And so what we're hoping you'll do today is listen to the material, and then after today's session, as part of that survey that Karen's going to send out, we're going to ask you if you have ideas for how we should focus the topics of these podcasts, because they are meant to be specifically for folks working in early education. And so we're really hoping that we can get some of your ideas and some of your input so that those podcasts are as relevant as possible as we move forward. And then finally, our center also engages in public awareness events and disseminating intervention services and different resources far and wide, all across the United States. So that's enough about us, but I'm going to pause and let Cassie. Do you want to say a quick hello, Cass, or introduce yourself to a greater degree? Are you on mute, Cassie? Okay. So you know what? I'm going to move on. Maybe Cassie can say more about herself when she starts her slides, which is in a few slides from now. And hopefully, Cass, if you're having audio problems, we'll get those figured out before then. So moving right along. These are the objectives for today's webinar, and they are short and sweet and straightforward. Number one, we're going to open by just talking generally about how stress and anxiety impact children. And in fact, we're going to talk a little bit about how they impact people in general. So not only children, but also adults. Number two, we're going to talk a little bit more about how we can support our kids. And when I say our kids, I mean the children, yes, in our homes, in our families, but also those in our classrooms. How we can support each other and ourselves. And then we're going to do that in part by sharing some concrete recommendations and resources. So what you'll see throughout the sections that we cover today is we have at least one or two resources relevant to each of the main points that we're covering. We will take time to review a few of them, and then in other cases, we'll just point you in the right direction and encourage you to go seek them out on your own. These are the few of the points that are critical to keep in mind as we go through our session today. Number one, we have here return to school will likely go better than people expect. We started making this presentation months ago. We realized that pretty much now everyone's in school. So it would be interesting to hear from you whether it has gone better than expected so far. Feel free to chat us up in the chat box. But we do like to keep in mind that there was a lot of concern about what school would look like. And from our personal experiences with our children, Cassie's are doing virtual, mine are doing in person, things have gone a little bit better than expected, which is great. We also want to point out that none of us know exactly what to do. So Cassie and I did a lot of reading and a lot of researching in preparation for this particular webinar, because this is brand new stuff. And frankly, even though we're trained psychologists, we don't know exactly what to do. So just to keep in mind, this is new information. We're all doing our best. And to that point, much of the information that we're presenting today, we're presenting for the first time. And the first time you do anything, sometimes you struggle through it. So fingers crossed we do well and that you get something from it. But just knowing that this is the first time we've tried to share some of the information in this presentation today. And then finally, the thing that we think is worth more than anything else is our use of creativity, our ability to be compassionate, our ability to be patient, and our ability to engage in self-care. And we mean that specifically for those of you that are in early education. The more you can be creative, compassionate, patient, and self-care, the better we're going to do. If you take away anything from the webinar, that's probably number one. Okay, Anne, thank you for your comment. You have not gone back to school yet. Excellent. Okay, so October 26th is the magic date when you go face to face, but it sounds like you're doing virtual probably until then. And then Christy, you guys just started this week. Great. Okay. Remote on Wednesday for deep cleaning. Interesting. Excellent. Yeah, thank you guys. So now we're going to have a couple of polls so that we can get to know where you guys are at. We'd like to know, for those of you on this call, in your role as an educator, someone that's working in education, are you doing your work right now in person, fully remote, or in a combination of blended remote? So you have to look at your screen and you have to check one of those. We're just taking a quick survey here to find out where folks are at. And we'll give it just a few more seconds as people weigh in. It looks like 18 people have weighed in so far, 16 people, 17. All right, so it looks like there's an even split between fully remote and blended remote, and only one person is back in person right now in the schools. Okay, fantastic. So we'll keep that in mind. We also have a couple more questions that we want to get some clarity on. So now we're going to ask about the roles that you're in. We assume that many of you are teachers, but we usually get a variety of professionals who weigh in here. So let's see who's in the room. Karen, I can't see the bottom of the roll on, or the bottom of the poll on my end. I don't know if that would be true for everybody, but I can only see down there. Thank you so much. Okay, so the majority of folks so far on the webinar today are teachers. We also have a good number of administrators or principals, a couple of instructional leaders, parent family educator, fantastic, teaching assistants, and others. And feel free, if you're other, feel free to go ahead and type in the box what role you have in your school. Thank you all for hanging in there. It's always good for us to know who we're talking to. And then finally, we have a third poll, and this has to do with the variety of ages, the children that you're teaching. So we want you to go ahead and check all of the boxes here with regards to the breakdown of the children that you're teaching. Again, Karen, I can't see the bottom of the poll. I don't know if people, if others can. Hopefully they can see everything. I can only see there. Thank you so much. All right, look at that. Okay, so the vast majority of the people on the phone today are teaching 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, with a few people engaging in older children, just a couple, and a few people with the 1 and 2-year-olds. Okay, this is great. I so appreciate it, you guys. It's nice for us to know a little bit about who we're talking to. Just going into it. So we are going to give you another poll in a couple of minutes, but I'm going to cover just another slide before we do that. And we're putting in a little bit of humor and a little bit of seriousness mixed together here in this next slide. So wishing you the most amazing 2020. Back in December 31st, 2019, none of us could have anticipated what we would be up against this year, right? We were probably celebrating the beginning of 2020 as we would any other year. But alas, we have faced a number of sources of stress and anxiety that have impacted not only children, but also us as adults. So the COVID-19 epidemic clearly has impacted every single person, probably across the world in one way or another. So many of us are fearful of getting sick. Many of us know people who have been sick. Some of us have had the misfortune of actually losing loved ones to the disease. But even folks who haven't had a personal loss or a personal illness, there are folks who have lost their job. There are children and families that are suffering from food insecurities. And many of us have had significant changes in our social lives, in the way that we recreate, in the way that we do the things that we normally do in order to keep ourselves happy and sane. All of that has been turned on its head. So even if that were the only bullet on this slide, we would have a lot to talk about, but it's not. The second thing that's happened this year is a real light has been shined on racism and the murder of unarmed Black people by police. So these are not things that are specific to 2020 or 2020. These are things that have been ongoing for centuries. However, there really has been an uprising this year, right? Which started right around the killing of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. It's resulted in a tremendous amount, no matter where you stand on these issues, a tremendous amount of pain, a tremendous amount of confusion and anger that has swept our society. And we've seen that come out in numerous ways. In addition to that, it's really important for us just to recognize that I have here return to school and shifting of learning plans, but this is really more than the return to school. Our teaching, our schools got turned upside down last March for many of us, right? So it was ending the last school year without having had any preparation. I imagine that none of you, when you were going through college, got trained on what to do in case there was a pandemic and how that impacts education, right? And so we've had to move very quick. We've had to be very creative. We've probably made several mistakes along the way, and that's just the way it goes. And then I know I have a fourth bullet here. That's what it was. So the other thing that's happening more right now is kind of the political divisiveness that's present. So we've got our elections coming up. We've got this nominee for the Supreme Court right now. Without taking sides, because that's not the purpose of this particular talk, but it's just to recognize that there's a lot of stress. There's a lot of reasons for family members to get frustrated with family members, for neighbors to get frustrated with neighbors. So not only are we isolated from one another, but we may also be more likely to kind of be at each other's throats, so to speak. So this is what we're up against, and this is why we're having this presentation today. I do think we were going to throw up another poll really quick here with regards to the benefits. Yes, so here's what we'd like you to respond in the text, in the chat. And take your time to do this, but what are some of the most difficult aspects or challenges of starting this school year with regards to the type of learning plan you're doing now? So whether you're remote or combined or in school, what has been the most difficult part of that? And what has been, in a minute, we're going to ask you about the easiest part of that. We're not going to get into a great deal on this. And if you can't come up with an answer right now, before the poll is over, that's okay. You can put your feedback into the chat box as we move forward. So maybe we'll just give folks a minute, and then we'll put up the second part, which asks the opposite of this question. Okay, so the most difficult, not allowing students to interact physically. The rules are constantly changing, absolutely, so staying safe. Not all families having accesses to the devices. Teacher to family communication is hard. Rethinking how to do things, getting to know students, especially new ones, over video calls, keeping staff and children safe. Thank you so much, you all. Social distancing, 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. And Karen is keeping all of your responses so that Cassie and I can reflect on them later and consider them for the discussion we're going to have in 2 weeks. Here's the other poll. So the opposite. What is the best part of starting this school year using the plan that you have in place right now? You know, are there any benefits? Are there perks? What have you gotten out of that? And okay, there we go. I was going to say the fact that we have no answer says something. Okay, so we'll feel safe, right? So that was the pressure lots of teachers were feeling, to have to go back into the classroom not knowing how safe they would be. Smaller staff sizes. Oh, interesting. So communication with parents is a pro and a con. Many parents have been patient. We've gotten to know our parents better. Oh, fantastic. And we felt safe until the decisions were made. Is there a best part? Right, that's what I was expecting to hear. So for some of you, there just isn't anything good about this. Children are still able to make connections with other students, even though they're on video. Great, you all. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. All righty. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on. I've got one more slide, and then we're going to switch over to Cassie. And this is just a slide meant to say that while the situations that have occurred during 2020 are incredibly abnormal, especially when they come in the particular package that they've come in, stress and anxiety are not. Stress and anxiety are normal human responses. All of us will experience anxiety and stress throughout our lives, and that's important for us to keep in mind. Stress and anxiety tend to be impacted by these 4 things, amongst others. So the first one is personality traits. We are all born with a particular propensity for being impacted by stress to a greater or lesser degree, and a propensity to experience anxiety to a greater or lesser degree. Not that we can't learn to change that with our behavior over time, but we are born into this world with a specific amount of sensitivity to these things. 2, life stressors. No matter who you are, what your sensitivity is, your stress and anxiety will depend upon what's going on around you at most times. 3, how our parents or caregivers and other important adults in our lives cope with stress is like probably the #1 predictor about how young children cope. So the more we as adults can stay calm and cool, or act it, fake it till you make it, the better the children in our lives will do. And then finally, the availability of social and emotional support, both for adults and children, is critical to dealing with stress, no matter who you are. So Cassie, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you now. Cassie was pointing out to me that I went a little bit over my time. So Cassie, yeah, feel free. I will calculate a little bit more time on your end. I'm passing it to you.
Okay. Hi, can you hear me okay, Tracy? Okay, great. And I don't know if my video is showing or not. I don't want to take too much. Oh, let me just say if I can do that to say hello. Hi, everybody. If you can see me okay, and then I'll just do this on for the first part and maybe turn it off because I have been having some technology issues. Oh, thank you, Karen. I am on. And I am just to add a little humor to this, I had a little bit of a stress moment in the middle since one of the challenges I know we're all facing, especially if we're in this either fully remote or blended remote learning model, is the challenges of technology, of which I was having some when you asked me a question earlier. So Tracy, I apologize. I've been having some issues with my speaker and microphone. So hopefully, fingers crossed, will hold out. But I just want to do a quick introduction. Hi, everybody, and thank you again for inviting us to be a part of this. Karen and Cindy, I also see you on the participant list of Cindy Berry. And Karen, you've been wonderful collaborators over the years, and I think it's going on 5+ years that we've been working with the two of you in partnership with these webinars that we've been doing. So we're very happy to be here today. And as Tracy said, Tracy and I have been collaborating for many, many years together, and we always have a lot of information and we do a lot of our homework, but as a result, we try to pack a lot in. So we're really glad and fortunate that this time we also have a follow-up discussion with you on Zoom in a couple of weeks where we can get into some more of the depth and into some of your questions. So as Tracy said, I'm the director of our National Child Traumatic Stress Network Center, and we've been collaborating with our partners in the area of early childhood is one of our areas of focus. So we're really happy to try to be responsive to what some of the needs are that we've heard and what we're all facing, both as on your end as educators and all of us as parents and caregivers in various roles. So Karen, am I advancing the slide? I can't remember. Oh, let's see. Yes, I can. Great. One of the things that Tracy had pointed to was the anxiety and that many of our children and ourselves as providers and caregivers are often facing in the midst of the pandemic or the multiple pandemics that we're all facing, as Tracy described. And I think one of the things to note is that when we look at the responses of kids and young kids in particular, is that some level of stress and worry and angst are normal in the midst of an ever-changing situation that we're facing, in the midst of COVID-19, in the midst of the racial injustices that we're facing in our country and the political situation, as Tracy mentioned. And on top of that, I think some would describe this also as a mental health pandemic that we're having. So we're seeing a lot of angst in many different roles. And I think it's really important for all of us to be able to pay attention to that and what some of the common signs of stress and coping might be. So if you look at this list here, I'm not going to read through all of it, but just to touch on a couple, some common signs of stress in children are difficulties with attention and concentration, which obviously would impact some of their school performance and their attention, whether they be in person or remote. Perhaps some difficulties with irritability, anger, just being able to stay perhaps engaged fully in the context of their work, and maybe getting more easily frustrated for a variety of very logical reasons, right? And we may see some of that manifest in terms of their sleeping, their eating habits, and we may see that expressed both as parents and as educators in terms of how we see some of these things come up in terms of their worry about a range of different things. And we may see that in terms of worry about the future. We may see difficulty, especially if you're in the in-person situation or a blended remote model, more difficulty separating from caregivers. And these are things we could see across ages, actually, not just for young kids. We've even seen evidence of this in school-age kids and in teenagers as well. So a lot of things may be coming up. And there also may be difficulty with just being flexible to the changes, because there are a lot of things that there's a lot of uncertainty and a lot of not knowing. And I think one of the things I've heard in my kids' school, for instance, even some of the teachers, I just had parent-teacher conferences last night on Zoom, and just the teachers' uncertainty about what's happening. They're not sure what the clear directives are from administrators, what's going to be happening in the future. So a lot of uncertainty, which can affect all of us in various ways. And so I think that's important to keep in mind. But the key for all of us is to think about how do we approach these changes, these ongoing changes, this uncertainty, as providers, as caregivers, with some compassion and acceptance so that we can really set that role model for our students and our kids about how to best, how to approach stress in different ways. And that's some of what we're going to be talking about in the next few slides. One of the things I just want to note, and we'll talk about this towards the end, there are several amazing resources, which I believe Karen posted for you or shared with you, that we're going to be talking through and touching on some of the key points. And one of those is one of the first ones that came out actually in the early spring, and the one I'm referring to now and pulling some information from is the Parent and Caregiver's Guide to Helping Families Cope with COVID-19. And one of the nice things that it does in a nice simple way is just lay out some of the signs of stress that we may see more commonly by age during the pandemic. And so given that most of you are working with kids in the preschool age and some into the school age, some of these things that you may see manifest are some of the fear of being alone, perhaps more clinginess, changes in appetite, increase in tantrums. We may see regression in certain behaviors. We may see, difficulty separating. So we may see a lot of these things. And then if you look down at sort of school age, you may see that come out more so in terms of their interaction with peers, loss of interest, more withdrawal, forgetfulness. And within adolescence, we may see more signs of what might be depressive symptoms. So for instance, some of these agitation, isolation, physical symptoms. And so these are important things to just keep in mind and note that these are common, but it's when we look at the full picture of things. I'm just going to move through this more quickly. Oh, Tracy, thank you for the reminder. I may turn my camera off just because of the bandwidth issues. So one of the things to keep in mind is that as we talk about this in terms of different age groups, it's important for us to pay attention to several different things and for us to attend to the social emotional learning aspects as we think about our role as educators or providers in various roles. And so, as Tracy pointed out, maybe now more than ever, we have an important focus on social emotional learning in our work, and thinking about how do we support our kids in our classrooms, ourselves as educators, as providers, as parents in our own right, and how do we support each other? And so this requires perhaps a shift in our thinking in terms of how we approach things, but where mental health and well-being, including social emotional learning, is a focal point, is an important focal point. And so the focus of our presentation today is really around, Karen, thank you for that note. Yesterday afternoon, all of the handouts were set with a link. So you should have access to all these resources. So one of the things just to note, today we're going to be focusing on some of the responses of children. How do we support children in our classroom? But we do want to hear from you, as Tracy said, as we plan for our our podcast in the future, because one of the things we also know that supporting each other and self-care of ourselves as providers ourselves, as educators, in your role is also equally important. And so we will touch on that in some different places, but really get to that in more detail in a future session. And Tracy, if you wouldn't mind just kind of giving me a note, because I don't remember when I started, my time stamp, that would be helpful, just so we can stay on track. So from this perspective, some of the things we're going to be, I'm going to move more quickly. From this perspective, we're going to be touching on things in three broad areas. So physical and psychological safety, emotional well-being, community and inclusion, and flexibility, and how to do what works in the current capacity that we're in. And let me go to the next slide here. And so I'm going to just be touching on a few aspects related to physical safety and emotional well-being. And if you all are simultaneously looking, or you have some of the handouts at your fingertips, a terrific resource that has some wonderful tips and strategies, particularly for educators, is a resource called Coping in Hard Times. It's a fact sheet for school administrators and personnel, and some wonderful resources and strategies that come out of that particular that particular resource that I want to call your attention to. And so I'm going to just go on to the next slide here. And so I'm going to touch on a few a couple of points here around physical and really what I would call kind of more broadly physical and psychological safety, as well as well-being, and some things that we might want to keep in mind. So the areas that we're going to go through in this regard is understanding who is at risk and why. So who is at risk for mental health challenges in particular in our classroom? Who might need some extra support? Who might need some extra, perhaps referral to additional services? How do we then think through or prioritize open communication with each other, with both our students, but with each other as providers? How do we focus on emotional expression and regulation, and then instill a sense of hope and creating opportunities for joy? So really building upon our resiliency that is definitely there throughout this process. Okay, let's see. Okay, I'm looking at Tracy's note. Okay, so let me just touch on these last couple of slides quickly before I toss it back over to Tracy. We're going to have some more back and forth here. So it's important for us to understand which kids may be at particular risk in the context of the work that we're doing, and it may be particularly at risk not only of exposure to COVID-19, but also to some mental health difficulties. And it's important that we don't necessarily make assumptions around this, but really think about and pay attention to some of the signs that we may be seeing. So those kids who have perhaps a history of previous mental health challenges, anxiety or depression, or who have previous issues with learning and attention, or even a history of trauma or exposure to violence in their home, might have a greater risk factor for some of the mental health challenges because of what they may have been facing already. And then what we know about stress is that when additional stresses get layered on top of that, sometimes the coping responses, the healthy coping responses, can break down even further. So again, kind of pay attention to that. We also know that this particular time has posed many challenges and financial stresses for families, where there's job loss, there may be additional stressors on the home life where parents may become separated due to illness, or perhaps due to divorce, separation due to loss. And so there are particular challenges that go along with that as well. I think that with that comes, perhaps food insecurity, job loss, lack of childcare supervision, where there are more challenges on the home front, which really compound not only ability to stay on task and focus on learning, but also some of the mental health consequences that go along with it. So access to caregivers may be limited. There may be limited space in the home, for instance, to focus on learning, and so that may pose additional challenges when children are at home doing remote learning. The other thing to pay attention to is that we know that there's additional risks for exposure to COVID-19 in particular. We already know that healthcare workers, for instance, are at greater risk. But one of the things that we know from some of the recent work and studies that have been done over the last couple of months is that unfortunately, there is that those who are in Black and Brown communities, both within the Chicago area and across the country, are unfortunately exposed at disproportionate rates to COVID-19, the pandemic. So as a result, there's a lot of layers associated with that. So I think Tracy will talk about this a little bit further in the presentation, how that really kind of gets compounded also by the racial injustices that we're facing as a country, and how this can impact and really multiply stress kids and families in different ways. So I think it's just important for us to keep that context in mind. And then my last slide real quickly that I'll go before tossing it over to Tracy is that I would just encourage you to take a look at this list of some of the common signs of anxiety and depression that we may be seeing in our children. And also perhaps within our own loved ones, within adults as well, and even within ourselves, that we may see these compounded a bit more during this time of particular stress and anxiety that we're facing in our country, in our world. And some of those common signs that you'll see of anxiety, I'll just name off a couple: persistent worry, stomach aches, headaches, feeling jumping on edge. Those common signs of anxiety and common signs of depression are maybe more of that withdrawal, isolation, sadness, loss of motivation, loss of energy. And I think it's important to keep in mind that it is one or two of these kinds of symptoms in isolation are not necessarily a cause for concern, but when we see an array of symptoms that can maybe interfere with day-to-day functioning, interfere with their focus or engagement in school activities, those can be cause for concern and perhaps thinking about referral to more services. We do know that, I know from my own experience that I think the good news is that as parents and caregivers, as we're talking to our kids, that more children, at least in school age that I interact with, are at least speaking up and accessing mental health services because they realize their kids may need them more. So it's just something important to note for ourselves as we're doing this work and interfacing with families where there might be a need for additional help and support. So Tracy, I know I went a bit over, but I'm going to toss it back to you now and turn my microphone on.
Okay, sounds fantastic. Thanks, Kath. I just put a little note of encouragement into the chat that all of you can read, following up on Cassie's coverage of, when we might need to seek some mental health. And while teachers and other school staff have an important role in making referrals for children and families, you also have to really consider taking care of yourselves right now. Therapy is not just for folks with mental health problems, right? Or with chronic mental health problems. It's okay to seek services short time for right now. So that's my plug there. Now we're moving into communication. So I think communication was the third piece of physical safety and emotional well-being. And this is really about how to talk to kids about all this crazy stuff happening around us. So these are some ground rules, some basic ideas. I bet there are many more that you all could add to this list and the ideas on the next couple of slides. So feel free, if you have good suggestions or questions, to put them in the chat. But this is the basics. Number one, whether you're on video, one-on-one with a family, whether you're in person with a family or just with a child, allowing children to talk, paying attention and being a good listener, if you do nothing else, is the most critical piece. So children will here and there, many of them, speak up and talk about COVID, talk about racism, talk about politics. My 5-year-old told her grandparents the other day she wanted to watch the debate and it made them laugh out loud. So, really just listening and committing to that without feeling like you have to have all of the right answers, and knowing that by just being a good listener, you're taking a huge step to helping children be emotionally well. Number two, we would even go the next step and say, not only listening, but whenever you have the opportunity to actually start the conversation. There are a lot of folks out there over the past many months that have been thinking, especially for our youngest kids, if we start to talk about COVID out loud, that's only going to increase their sense of stress and anxiety. And research, decades old research, tells us that the opposite is actually true. The more we can talk openly about COVID, openly about racism, just like we do everything else, the less secretive, the less scary it becomes. And how to talk to kids about that? Well, first of all, it's always good to start conversations by asking kids if they have any questions. Do you have any questions about what's been going on these days? Do you have any questions about why school looks different this year? How do you feel about the way school is this year? Just, allowing them to ask questions that you pose to them and to just come up with their own questions. When they do start to ask questions, whether they're easy or they're hard, we would encourage you to think about how to provide just enough information. So there's a lot of questions out there right now that grown-ups do not have the answers to, no matter what field you're in. There are even scientists out there that don't understand pieces of COVID-19. So we can't go in expecting that we're going to be able to provide long, detailed, accurate answers to every question a child poses. Just not a reasonable expectation. So really what we want is to look for bite-sized pieces of information that we do know, that we can offer to kids, and that when we don't know the answer to what they're saying, to remember it's okay to say, gosh, that's a really good question. I don't know, right? That's a great question. I think we should look into that, shouldn't we? And then circle back around to them at some point in the future. It is important, though, that we're taking the opportunity while we're listening and after they're done talking to gently but firmly correct any inaccurate information they have. So for example, if a child tells us that police kill Black people because they're bad, our response is no, sweetheart, no, right? It's not the color of someone's skin that makes them good or bad, right? So these little tiny bite-sized pieces are often enough for children, especially when the information is accurate enough. It will take some practice and we will likely get things wrong, but that is okay, right? We learn from our mistakes just like everybody else. Distraction is okay, but it shouldn't be overused. So if children are asking things, questions that you're not quite prepared to answer, or you don't want to say, I don't know to, or what they've put out there is just too difficult, it is okay to use distraction here and again, right? But it shouldn't be overused because if we're constantly distracting children away from what is at the forefront of their mind, all we're doing is contributing to their stress and anxiety by telling them, one, you shouldn't be having these ideas, or two, this is too scary to talk about. These are not things that are allowed to talk about. And then finally, the final bullet on this page really has to do with connecting with parents. And I did note that there are a couple people who are saying it's really hard to connect with parents right now. So, you don't have the opportunity to grab them as they're dropping their kids off because they're not dropping their kids off, perhaps, right? But others were saying that it's easier than ever to connect with parents. So if at all possible, setting aside a 10-minute check-in with individual families, asking them directly, I'm just wondering how things have been. How has your child been impacted by everything going on? Is there anything in particular that we should be aware of so that we can provide some extra support? So the more that you can open up communication, not only with the child, but with his or her family, the better off. Moving into talking just a tad bit more about responding to difficult questions. We've done a version of this presentation, though it was much simpler and it was several months ago. And one of the biggest areas of focus was on how do I talk to kids when they bring these things up. So we just want to remind you, the first thing you do is take a breath, right? Take a deep breath and listen. Number two, it's always okay to tell kids what a great question they've raised, right? Or to really praise them for being so curious. I love how you're always asking me things. You are just really thinking about this, right? Again, it's okay to say, I'm not sure. And sometimes when we're not sure, we can just turn it back on them and say, what do you think? Or what have others said about this question? Because sometimes they're testing us, they're collecting data to find out what the right answer is. So finding out what they know or what they already think can sometimes be helpful. And sticking to the facts and simplifying a message. Again, it's something that comes with practice, but as people who know young children, you probably already do this in a bunch of different ways. About a month ago, my 5-year-old climbed into bed with us very early in the morning, and she and I were the two people left in the bed. When it was time to get up, it was a weekend, and she rolled over. First words out of her mouth to me, very first words, Mommy, do people die right after they get the coronavirus, or does it take a few days? And I was like, wow, good morning. But I sat there and I listened and I said, oh, sweetheart, most people don't die when they get the coronavirus. And she said, oh, all right, can you make pancakes for breakfast? Right? And it was just this very simple piece of information sharing. All she needed to, that was enough for her. And so really just giving bite-sized pieces of information, simplifying what we're telling them is oftentimes enough, especially for our younger kids. And when we can reframe, when we can put a positive frame on things that is still honest, that's even better. Then the final slide on communication. So these are real examples that came from a local school. This school is not just a preschool, so it does teach 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds, and 5-year-olds, but it also has students going all the way up to 8th grade. And what this administration and teachers decided to do is they came together, and before the start of the school year, they identified things that they can say and things that they probably shouldn't say with regards to how to communicate. So as you can see here, some of the things that they decided they would say, we wash our hands and we cover our faces so we don't share germs. We're doing a lot of things to keep both ourselves and other people safe. We don't want anybody to get sick, but if they do, then we let them, or we want them to stay home until they get better, right? It's great to see our friends and our teachers, but we can't get as close as we used to. And then finally, with regards to racism or the racial injustice, if we all looked and we all acted the same, the world would be a very boring place. And that's something that some of them said they've been teaching students for a long time now. But it's a really nice, simple way of inviting diversity. And the last one there, every single person deserves respect, no matter what, right? Or no matter who they are. And then the things that they decided they should avoid saying is, people can die, people are dying. So if children bring up death or dying or ask questions about that, we shouldn't pretend like it's not happening. We can respond to that. But this school said, we're not going to bring that up. We're not going to be telling kids that you got to wash your hands because you're going to get the coronavirus or because you're going to die or because other people are dying. There was also one teacher in this school that had, at the end of the previous school year, talked about how masks don't really work. And so they decided to make sure everybody knows that that's really not messaging that we want to share with folks. So regardless of what your personal perspective is on masks or other PPO, is that it? The protective equipment, PPE, that's it. That's not really something, we don't need to share those sorts of doubts with our children. And then finally, all lives matter was something that they decided as a school that they don't want to say. And it's not because it's not true. All of us know that all lives matter, absolutely, 100%. But the issue at hand right now, and the rallying cry, is that Black lives matter. Because there are a lot of instances in the day-to-day treatment of people in the United States that show they don't matter. And so if you have children or families or staff in your school that are Black or white or brown or purple, and they have gotten behind this Black Lives Matter moment as a way of saying, hey, let's pay attention to this group of people that have been oppressed forever. To say something like all lives matter, despite the fact that it's true, is also very invalidating and could come off and be received in a really negative way, regardless of what your intention is. All right, so moving right along. This is the thing to remember where sometimes we won't have the right words and sometimes it doesn't matter, because even more important than words sometimes are your tone and your facial expression, right? So getting down at the child's level, again, this really gets to listening too. Just listening, just staying calm. You guys have probably all heard the fake it until you make it. And this is some of the times. Cassie and I are trauma professionals. We specialize in interpersonal trauma. And so we talk with people all the time about how if children bring up real things that are really scary for us or really hard to hear, our number one goal is to stay calm, right? And to keep a calm face. It's okay, It's okay to show empathy, absolutely, right? But we also want to maintain that matter-of-fact attitude. So when my daughter asked me, if you die immediately after getting the coronavirus or if it takes a few days, right? Rather than freaking out and being like, oh, baby, I'm so sorry you're thinking about this. It's, oh, honey, most people don't die, even though inside my head was spinning. Like the more we can kind of put forth this steady Eddie perspective to the kids, the better off we are. We need to keep in mind in order to do that, that there are no single right answers. There are a million different versions of responding to different sorts of questions like this. And that, yes, we will step in it sometimes, whether we're talking about racial justice, whether we're talking about COVID-19, whether we're talking about the political system that we have in place right now, we are all occasionally going to say something that upsets someone else or that we regret saying. And the best thing we can do is be gentle with ourselves, be forgiving of ourselves, learn from our mistake, apologize if necessary, and move on with the promise to do better next time. Okay, so this is our first resource that we wanted to highlight. This is a book, but it also has YouTube videos available in both Spanish and English. This is something that you can download for free from the internet. There is the website right there. This book was written by a good friend of mine and Cassie's, who is also a psychologist. She is in San Francisco. The pictures were drawn by her husband. And she is also one of the co-developers of a really great trauma-focused interventions for kids called Child Parent Psychotherapy. So we encourage you to check that out, but we're not going to open up that webpage and take a look at it here together today. This is where I'm going to pass it back to Cassie again. Please feel free to keep your comments or questions coming in the chat. It keeps things interesting and lets us know we're not talking to the thin air. So Cassie, back to you.
Okay, thank you so much, Tracy. Like we said, we do have a lot of information. We will, we're doing our best to try to make it applicable, but please share your comments or questions as we go along, and we will be sure to circle those back into our both today, but also into our future Zoom discussion for those of you who can join that. So some things to just keep in mind, and I have to note this because it's very relevant to our discussion. You know, in the ever-changing landscape that we're in and dealing with uncertainty, I think self-regulation is so critical, and feeling expression and regulation. And I was just looking at one of our APA, American Psychological Association resources, and I think one of the things to note, and I think because as we hold both aspects, which are obviously very interrelated, the social emotional learning and attending to feeling expression and regulation, and also the academic learning, self-regulation is so intertwined with that, both in terms of in the classroom and with remote learning. And one of the things that we know in terms of the science of learning is that self-regulation can both facilitate learning, but these skills can also be taught. So I think they're quite important in this era that we're in. The one piece of news that just kind of threw me off as I was listening to Tracy is I get a feed from Chicago Tribune, and they just announced as of today that pre-K students in Chicago Public Schools will be returning in the next trimester, whereas the older kids are going to be holding off and doing more remote instruction. So I'm sure there'll be all sorts of feelings and reactions to that for those of you who may interface with CPS. But I think this is just, I think what we're up with is, as we said earlier, this constant uncertainty and changing plans as we learn to cope with that. And I think we all, both children that we work with and ourselves as professionals, have reactions to that. And I think one of the key things to keep in mind is that expressing our feelings is really critical, and being able to normalize and validate our feelings and reactions to the situations is key as well. And I think especially as we're working with young kids, when we think about even reminding them how it's normal to have those feelings of loneliness, isolation, boredom, I think fears that may come up. And it's just important for us to be able to acknowledge that as long as I know it was a big focus of conversation early in the pandemic when my kids were at home and they thought they were going to be going back to school, and then we kept seeing the process go on longer, when many of us thought it was just going to be a couple of weeks or a month. And I think there was a lot of attention to that earlier, at least speaking for myself. But even as, having two mental health professionals as parents, myself and my husband, I think we can sometimes forget that those feelings are still, that it's important for us to just kind of pay attention to those, and they're going to maybe surface in different ways. And I think to validate whatever feelings and remind kids that those feelings are normal to have, and validate instead of saying that you don't need to worry, you don't need to be upset. This may actually cause kids to shut down and cause them to not want to share. But instead, we want to listen for ways to just, that they may be telling us and sharing us the signs of how they're feeling. And they may show us those reactions through their behaviors, as they may be struggling with different things. Those may be some signs of their emotional responses. And as I said earlier, it's important for us to just approach those kinds of behaviors and reactions, and whether they come up as inattention or problem staying on task or irritability, to approach those things with compassion and understanding, knowing that there may be different ways of responding to what's happening. And then notice that also when kids may on their own use some of those
Cassie, you just muted your mic.
Down. Thank you, Karen. That was an accident with my cursor. Thank you so much. They may actually kind of take it upon themselves to calm themselves down. And I think we want to praise and reinforce that behavior for appropriate self-expression, but we also want to listen maybe for some self-defeating statements that we may see, that kids may say, this something is, my fault, or, something really kind of noting when we see things that they may blame themselves, or they may think that something, as Tracy noted, may happen that's really kind of thinking the worst, and we may want to redirect them to say, I understand why you're frustrated, or understand why you may think that way, but kind of just reframing things in a more realistic tone as well is important for us to do. And it's also important for us to take our own temperature frequently and see how we may be reacting to current circumstances, and see how that gets manifested in our interaction with kids, and take our own timeouts when we need to, take our own steps back. So as we continue to think about this, and I know this is something that you all as educators of young kids probably do a lot of already, but the feeling expression and teaching feelings vocabulary, teaching feeling expression skills is really key, especially now as we're facing so many different emotions. And I think some examples here are perhaps some posters and wall hangings with different feeling words, how we can kind of remind kids that there are different labels for feelings. We can teach about talking, singing, reading, writing, and doing and artistic expressions about different feelings. So there are different ways to name them and to teach those feeling words and facial expressions as we do as a part of, as you may likely do as part of your curriculum already. But just thinking about that is an important part, especially during this time. And it's important for us to note how right now, human beings, everybody is going to have all sorts of feelings, and all feelings are okay to express. And it's normal to have mixed feelings, more than one feeling at a time. So some of these feeling facts that might be useful to as we're teaching kids and reminding them about that these things are all normal. And then also at the same time teaching them skills for how do we help ourselves calm down, because there are certain ways that are not okay to show feelings. So we want to teach them some appropriate ways. It's okay to have those feelings, but how do we express them in appropriate ways? And so some of these examples are ways to incorporate different activities that may help them to calm down. So in creating spaces, which I know many of you do already when you're in the classroom, but how do we think about doing this virtually as well, which I'm sure is a bit more of a challenge. So how do we create those safe spaces or spaces to help kids calm down, cool down, and creating those opportunities, irregular opportunities to reset. So creating those kind of relaxing spaces. And I think as we work with kids online, thinking with them about how and what can they do at home when they feel stressed, what kinds of strategies or tools can they engage them? And you may be doing that already. I'm curious if you have any ideas that you want to put in the chat, ways that you may be helping kids to reset or to regulate when they're working remotely. So I think it's important to kind of explore a variety of different techniques, obviously because we're in this new environment, but also because different things works for different kids. So there's a variety of different techniques that we can do and we can teach people to do. Guided meditation, yoga, breathing are things that we can teach remotely. We can teach kids to learn. So, kind of the muscle relaxation, stretching, different things. I'm in the context of meetings and trainings a lot, and some trainers are really good at building and stretching breaks or regulation breaks or just kind of some of those meditative breaks, which I have to say are great at resetting and getting you to really turn inward to your body and what you're really feeling. So I've appreciated those kinds of things that others have tried to build into their teaching and training opportunities as well. Okay, it looks like my time is about up. I want to say that as far as one other thing I want to say about this, as far as role model feeling expression, is that it's also important to talk about our own feelings as adults and providers and caregivers. And that can be really powerful for kids to admit when you're feeling frustrated, to admit when you're feeling nervous. So such that, if you're seeing somebody, for instance, in person for the first time, you can admit that, you're really excited to be seeing everybody in person, but you're a little bit nervous as well. So really kind of showing and modeling the complexity of feelings can be really powerful for kids to hear when they hear adults admitting their own feelings. And also admitting when you need to take a break, when you're getting frustrated and overwhelmed, or noticing when your voice gets, the tone of your voice changes, just so that you're modeling that labeling of feelings and needing to step back and calm down as well. So I'm going to toss it back to Tracy, I think, here for this next section.
Cass, I was just putting in a link to this really, I don't know if you guys have seen it, but there's this woman on YouTube, I think it's called Cosmic Kids, that does this yoga, but they're like themed with the Disney film. So there's a Moana yoga, there's an Elsa yoga. They're really fun. So things that you can think about incorporating as you move forward for the emotional regulation stuff. So Kathy and I, just to be really upfront, oh good, Christy, you've seen her. She is awesome. Kathy and I are running behind. We had a lot of information here. We're about probably 13 minutes behind as of right now. So I'm going to go ahead and show this video, but we may skip some of the upcoming videos. So this is just a video we wanted to share with you. I'll talk about it in a minute. Let's just take a look.
Hey there, Nixie, there's no need to hide. Come along with Nimbo on an awesome ride.
Après-vous, Grasshopper? That temple has the best view in the whole world.
We're flying up there, right?
Sorry, kid, but we gotta earn the view. Hey, I don't make the rules.
I can't climb all the way up there.
Sure you can. Of course, they make it look easy. If you want to climb like a monkey, you gotta learn to breathe like a monkey. Come on. They practice this all day long.
They're just breathing.
Not just breathing, deep breathing. It allows them to slow that worried feeling down anytime, anywhere. I know, it's weird to think about breathing, but it gets easier the more you practice.
I still don't feel so good.
Me neither. I told you I didn't like heights. If we get worried again, we'll remember the monkeys and breathe. Maybe we should slow it down.
It's not working.
Well, it's not magic, kid. It takes time. You just gotta stick with it. Breathe. Slow it down. And breathe.
Okay, so Karen, I'm going to go ahead and stop the video there. This is a series of videos. That's number 3. I think there are 6 or 7 altogether, and they are beautiful, and they are 2 to 3 minutes each, and they teach really critical emotional regulation skills that are relevant to not only kids, but also adults. So I strongly encourage you to check those out, and they are totally free, which is always great. So now we're moving into the 4th piece of, I think there's 4 and then 5. So this is the importance of instilling hope and creating opportunities for joy as a critical piece of emotional well-being. It's actually the last piece of the emotional well-being, and then we're going to move into the power of building community. So the next 2 videos really focus, these next 2 slides really just in a nutshell talk about the fact that it is critical for human beings to have hope, period. It is critical for human beings to have joy, period. And so anything that we can do in our classrooms that instill hope or create joy in our children right now should be more important than ever. In my personal opinion, as a psychologist and the parent of a kindergartner, I want my children to be doing things in school that help them feel emotionally connected more than I want them to be doing math right now. And I do not speak for all parents or all teachers, but if there is ever a time to emphasize the social emotional over the rote learning that is super important and needs to happen, now is the time. So on this slide, there's just a variety of things that can help us remember about how to help kids instill hope. First of all, remembering that sometimes just checking in with them and asking them how they're feeling or how they're doing is an important step towards instilling hope. Different kids will feel different about what's happening. By opening up the door and finding out how they're doing or how hopeful they're feeling, you can even say, how hopeful are you feeling about this year? Will give us a sense of how hard we have to work in this area, right? It is perfectly okay to acknowledge that things are hard. When we're trying to help other people feel hopeful, it doesn't mean that we put an optimistic spin on everything. Part of having hope is also being grounded in reality. So understanding, yeah, it's hard to keep our mask on. Yeah, your hands get all dry when you wash them all day. Whatever the problem is, it's okay to recognize it and still look for the silver lining. But putting the silver lining on things, by doing these things that are hard, by learning online, by wearing masks, each and every one of us is helping the world to get better quicker, right? Because the world has a virus right now, and the job of the people is to try and do everything we can to help that virus go away. And this is the way that you can help. Also, approaching everything with a growth mindset is something that's really emphasized in a lot of the resources that we reviewed, right? So helping children, no matter where you are on the spectrum of learning or being, there is always space to get better. There's always that opportunity, and there's reason to be hopeful. And then finally, probably the most critical piece of information on this slide is in the final bullet, and that has to do with uncertainty. So if we've ever been taught a lesson in uncertainty, it's in 2020. No one could have predicted what's come already. No one can predict what's to come. And so we really have to get comfortable with uncertainty. And when talking with kids about uncertainty, sometimes it's helpful to use really concrete examples. So for example, we are all certain that every child will probably every child, if not 99.9% of them, will lose their two front teeth at some point in their life, right? Their baby teeth are going to fall out. Do we have any idea when that's going to happen, child to child? No, we don't, but we know it's going to happen. Most children are going to learn to ride their bikes without their training wheels. Some kids will learn when they're 3. Some kids will learn when they're 12, right? So it's this idea of helping kids understand that there are certain things in life that we know, period, and there are other things that we just don't, and finding the fun and finding the joy in that. You know, I don't know the type of classrooms that you're running or what the culture of your classroom is, but if there's room for fun and humor, you know, making bets about when we'll get to take our masks off. Will it be in 2nd grade? Will it be in 1st grade? You know, just finding ways to engage with the uncertainty and making it okay. The next slide is a silly slide. You'll see there, how do you get a squirrel to like you, to act like a nut, right? So having jokes, having physical challenges for kids during the day. You see a kid standing on one foot, you see a tub turned over there with a drum. So finding ways that will bring joy into your virtual classroom may be one of the most challenging things you can do, right? Children, especially young children, are not designed to sit in front of a computer for 5 hours a day. Even adults, right, hate being on Zoom for 5 hours a day, for 3 hours a day. And so it is important that we give kids break. And Cassie will talk a little bit about that before we end our presentation today. But it's also important that they have opportunities, not just for breaks, but to have collective fun together, right? To sing or to make music together, to get up and move their bodies, right? To engage in celebrations when there are birthdays, to have opportunities that are for nothing more than just plain silliness. So, you know, if kids are at school, they have in-person recess. How do we create a virtual recess for kids, right? And so if folks are doing this already or have ideas how to do this, feel free to share that with your peers here in the chat box and share it with us. But really, this is just a reminder that this is a critical piece of being a teacher right now, just having fun. And it can take priority over other things that it normally may not take priority over. We give you our permission for that, and hopefully your school administrators will go along with that. All right, so where are we headed here? Oh, that's right. You guys know where the raise your hand function is? I'd like for folks to raise their hand if they've heard about Go Noodle or if they've been on the Go Noodle website, just to see. Oh my gosh, okay, this is fantastic. So, wow. All right, so a lot of you have been on Go Noodle. It looks like maybe just over 50% of you. Go Noodle is an awesome free website. It has a huge variety of short videos for kids. It encourages them to get up and move, many of them. It encourages them to act silly. And there are also videos that are encouraged to help them kind of calm themselves down as well. There are videos available in Spanish and in English. I was going to highlight some of the videos for you, but I'm not going to because we are running short on time. And so over here to the right, when you get this, you got the slides from Karen when you find them. These are just a few of my favorite. If you're new to Go Noodle, they also show a variety of the different types of activities. The one criticism I would give for Go Noodle is I don't think their website is super friendly. So when you get on the homepage, it looks like there are 20 videos and there are really hundreds upon hundreds. And so you really kind of have to play with the website to stumble on what you might like. They do have a good search function though. So even if you put in cheesecake, I guarantee you're going to find a video on cheesecake. But this is something that you might be able to use from the virtual learning environment to give your kids a chance to get up and be silly together. So we wanted to share that. Now we're moving into something that's a little bit more serious. Melting is really calming. So melting, I wonder, Carol, go ahead and keep typing and let us know if melting is one of the videos that are on Go Noodle or something different, okay? All right, so building community is one of the most critical aspects of helping kids get a good start to this school year, especially for kids and teachers that are doing this virtually. So when we're in person, there are all sorts of things you can do to make your classroom feel like yours. You can put things up on the wall. You can do things together in person as a class. Kids get to make friendships amongst themselves when they spend time together in the classroom. This is harder when you're not in person. And so the next few slides talks about what we can do to build cohesion, to build collaboration and community, if for no other reason than to decrease the negative impacts of social isolation, social deprivation, and social deprivation and division. So basically, now that I'm looking at this, I just said a lot of what's on this slide. Anything that we can do to put forth kind of a we're in this together attitude, we can do this together, creating opportunities to build a sense of belonging. So perhaps something that could help out with that would be making a class name. You know, what do you want your class name to be? Having an icon for your class. Creating opportunities for kids in the class to do group work or even just playing collaborative games. So rock, paper, scissors, by identifying 2 kids on the screen to go. You know, you can have a rock, paper, scissors off, 2 kids at a time. Or you could do that, you know, stand up or sit down game. So stand up if you've got a brother or a sister in your family. Sit down, you know, if you've got a dog in your home. Anything you can do that helps children begin to see the differences and the similarities between them and the other kids in their class. And then once you have a sense of who your class is, really articulating for the kids what you think makes your class special. What is it that's so special about this particular group of kids, this particular class, to help them begin to feel this solidarity. The other thing that we would encourage you to do is to think about the opportunities for family involvement, not only things like, you know, today's bring your parent to class day, which is probably easier than ever and something you wouldn't normally do, but also providing an opportunity for parents to build community. So having a parent coffee break, having a parent lunch, an opportunity for the parents to hang out with the teachers, with or without the kids. Even if it only lasts for 10 minutes, anything that we can do to talk to one another. Moving on to a bit of a more serious piece of building community, because a good part of it is about fun and enjoyment, but the other part is that we really need, as human beings who live on planet Earth, to do a better job of working less for diversity and more towards inclusion. And so you can see the little icon that's up on the screen there. Diversity means we've got a lot of different people looking and being a lot of different ways. Inclusion is that they all feel accepted and like part of a whole. And so these were some of the take-home messages that were present throughout the resources that we've shared with you. And it's a way to kind of think about what we do as individuals to honor inclusion and to honor equality and equity. So the first one is to make sure that we're making efforts, like proactive efforts, to build relationships with each and every student and family that is in our classroom this year. Like any other year, there are going to be students in your classrooms and family members that you are drawn to, right? You just naturally like, and there are going to be others that are much harder to like. That's reality. That's human nature. But anything we can do to build a relationship, regardless of that, with each and every student or family is a great start. Greeting every student, just getting online and saying every single student's name or commenting on every single student was one of the simple examples that came from the resources. You know, so it's the equivalent of the principals or the teachers that stand outside the school when we're in person and when we can touch each other and shake each kid's hand or say hello with their names or pat them on the back. We can do that virtually as well, and it really communicates a lot about inclusion. Making sure that we have equally high expectations, or at least high expectations of every student, is important, right? So there may be kids in your classroom that you don't expect will succeed in the same way other students succeed, but it doesn't mean that we should not have high expectations for them. Just understanding that success may look different in the end. Celebrating every student's individual strengths. So making sure that throughout the school year, the children in the class know what we love about all the other kids, right? We know the kids that are brave. We know the kids that are silly. We know the kids that bring really beautiful qualities to our classroom and that we love them. because of those strengths, because of those qualities, and helping kids know that we recognize those as teachers. These are also conversations that can be had one-on-one with children and families. Maintaining a high ratio of positive statements and rewards in relation to the number of consequences. And I imagine that consequences are pretty odd or weird or hard or challenging when we're online, right? How do you keep a kid's attention? And then how do you go about giving them a consequence if they're doing something to turn the classroom upside down, so to speak, right? And so it does take a lot more patience and a lot more creativity. But if you are using consequences, making sure, being really mindful that you're doing the same sorts of consequences for the same sort of misbehavior with every child, because children are savvy and children can feel left out and they can feel picked on, even when that's not our intention. So by just being a little bit more thoughtful, when do I give a certain consequence for what kind of behavior, and having rules that are understood and expectations that are equal across all kids is a really nice way of just being super proactive and super obvious about equity in the classroom. And then finally, more than ever, kids should feel valued and welcome regardless of their background or identity. We don't need to say a lot more about that. The last slide in my section here is about systemic racism in education. And this is a slide that just has 5 simple steps, although none of them are simple. The first one, learning about how racism impacts students. This was left out of my education. It may have been left out of your education. The good thing is there are a ton of resources out there available to us to learn more about it, but just really trying to understand more about what racism looks like in schools is an amazing step in the right direction. Number 2, learning about racial justice approaches that are happening. So on the screen there, Teaching Tolerance is a magazine put out by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And it's a beautiful, beautiful teaching. It's a movement. It's an awareness raising. Get on their website, check it out. It's got lots of great ideas for racial equity and racial justice. Don't beat yourself up if you take a misstep, if you get accused of something, if you get told you're doing something wrong. Be curious though. Do look inside. Do pay attention. Try and shine a light. Stereotypes exist in our society. It's ridiculous to say that we don't own them. Every single person here on this call in the whole world has stereotypes about other people. It's the way humans are made. And so to just understand the stereotypes that we've been taught over the years, and then to be gentle as we decide how to kind of dismantle those or how to challenge those, being courageous, taking action, and then finally never giving up. So Cassie, I'm going to pass it. Oh, wait, no. These are a couple of resources I encourage you to look into. So this is a whole entire learning program on school mental health in the context of racial violence. I have not had a chance to go totally through it, but what I have seen is quite good. And then this is an APA, American Psychological Publication, specific to ethnic and racial disparities in education. So we just wanted to give you a couple of places to get started if you didn't know where to turn. All right, Cass, now I really am turning it over to you. And we're cutting it close with time, so thanks for hanging in there with us, everybody.
Yeah, and thank you, Tracy. And as we are getting close to the end, I am going to really try to fly through these next couple of slides because, as Tracy noted, they're mostly resources. I just want to touch on a couple of final points and then really give some opportunity for reflection or comments if you all have any as well. So as we've pointed out throughout, a key to this process and all that we're doing is to be flexible, to be responsive, and to really do what works. And I love that image, Tracy. I just noticed that. Yeah, flexibility is the name of the game here. So as we've kind of touched on already, I think keeping routines at school and at home as consistent as possible, I think are comforting to kids at any age, I think, and can really help to reduce the stress. So they provide a sense of predictability, a sense of safety. I'm going to say a quote from my middle school daughter, who may actually be within earshot right now. Something that she said to me earlier on in the pandemic is that she liked to get up in the morning and get ready, even in the midst of remote learning, because it gives you a fresh start and it gives you a sense of accomplishment. So I think, and that really stuck with me because I think having that sense of routine and structure is really key really key to kids at any developmental stage, to really give them that consistency as much as possible. And I think one of the things for young kids to reinforcing, obviously there are new rules, new safety rules in place, whether we're, especially as kids transition back to in-person, it's really important to keep those in mind. But it's also important to reinforce the fact that even though we know this may go on for a bit longer than we would hope, we expect things will go back to some sense of normalcy at some point eventually, and keep reinforcing that. And the importance of that is really key for kids, and really planning for fun activities and as much as we can as we're getting into the fall season, into the holiday season. How can we kind of create a new sense of normalcy, a new sense of that fun in our schedule as families and as educators, to really kind of bring some of that to life. I think some pointers, and I'm gonna touch on a couple of things, and you all may have others, so I'm curious if you have particular pointers for remote instruction. But really, I think just that sense of gratitude for kids being, and I heard this from many teachers, even in the parent-teacher conferences I was just on, just the gratitude for keeping your camera on, for attending, for staying engaged, for allowing you into their home, and really praising that on-task behavior, celebrating some of the process, mind the mistakes, mind the power of mistakes. So noticing that, they're portals to discovery. We're all going to kind of, both as educators, as parents, as kids along the way, really understanding that this is how we learn. This is how we learn and grow. And even now more so than ever when we're in this new reality. Tracy already noted the bite-sized pieces, really breaking tasks and learning into smaller bite-sized pieces, repetition, and really engaging the kids as much as we can, involving kids, depending on their age, in planning, having them help to teach back, letting them choose from an array of tasks and offering input on what they should do and shouldn't do. So giving lots and lots of choices, I think, is important, and letting kids know that, tell kids to let you know when they need more help. So, and again, I've heard this from teachers of my older kids too, it's just how they really have appreciated when they've seen that attention and engagement, and really just reinforcing how that's so critical right now for us to hear from kids in this planning process. I'm going to touch on a couple of resources, and some of these are new. Thank you for the instruction, Karen, providing with communication tools like thumbs up or thumb down. That's awesome for nonverbal communication, right? Kind of showing them, right, giving them that feedback. That's awesome. A couple of things I want to note, because these are relatively newer resources and they have some wonderful tools and tips embedded within them. So this resource on trauma-informed school strategies during COVID-19 is a great resource. I would encourage you to look at both as educators, as administrators, because they have some really wonderful things that I think all of us could be paying attention to at different levels of the systems that we're in, ways that administrators can support their teachers, ways that we can support the kids that we're working with. So again, hitting on some of those points around routine, small chunks of information, but also just the importance of self-care and for our own staff, for educators as well. So it's a great newer resource. And this one I mentioned earlier, the American Psychological Association Starting School During the Pandemic, is also a great resource because it really touches on things in so many different ways, both in terms of how to support mental health, but also how do we identify areas to really to do this in the virtual learning space, and some really concrete strategies and ideas around that, and suggestions to both parents and administrators on how to implement some of these steps. So I really love these practical resource guides. The Taking Care of Yourself resource is around some self-care ideas that all of us can look at and learn from, how we can better support ourselves in the midst of all of this. These are some of the earlier resources that we touched on that are great National Child Traumatic Stress Network resources. We know there are a lot out there, so Tracy and I just wanted to highlight the ones that we really think are helpful and offer some concrete and useful information. So supporting children during COVID-19 and helping children with traumatic stress, separation and grief in these contexts. Offer some useful tips, not only for what to look for, but also ways we can talk to kids about some of these things. And then finally, another resource I wanted to highlight, which you may be aware of, is a resource from Sesame Street on everyday challenges and how to support both families, I think useful tips and resources for both caregivers as well as educators to think about, how do we support youth and the young kids and the stress that they may be feeling. So this particular resource is, I think we have it listed at the end, even if you just look up Sesame Street resources on COVID-19. It's designed to help families problem solve, help with kids expressing themselves and finding comfort and building resilience. So really some great videos and activities you can do with young kids. So I think 5 minutes, just like we planned, I wanted to pause here and see if there are any particular reflections on anything that you heard today that you'd like to comment on in the chat. As far as how this information is relevant to you as an educator or to students in your class, any particular concrete things you want to identify or questions that we can start to respond to today, but also keep in mind as we move to the next phase in a couple of weeks in the Zoom discussion session. So I'll pause here, and while people are thinking about that, please, we encourage you to list your ideas in the chat to any of these topics. And if there's anything more that you want to comment on, Tracy, feel free as well.
I think the only thing I would add is thank you all. We spoke very, very fast, and it's easy enough to tune out in a webinar. It's even easier when people are rushing through material. So thank you so much for hanging in there. Thank you for the comments that did go out there. And again, we're really looking forward to this discussion that we have on the, is it the 8th? No, 28th rather? No, when
28th, yeah.
Yeah.
28th? Yeah.
Yes.
And we do, I've forgotten, we have a follow-up survey, right, to get information from people.
Yeah.
So you don't have to think about all in the next 4 minutes, but you could comment on that in a follow-up. And I also, while people are commenting, I just want to put up a couple of useful websites just so folks know where you can also, if you want to find the link. So as we mentioned, the National Child Traumatic Stress Network has done a phenomenal job, I think, of developing and adapting a lot of these resources. So a great resource on race and trauma in the classroom and how to support some of those discussions. What some areas that we may want to think about further. A collection of COVID-19 related resources, many of which we interjected or interspersed in our presentation today. And then this is an additional one, some specific information that you may want, if you're interested in understanding more about anxiety and depression in kids, the CDC has a great resource and a lot of information on their website. I think that's all we have listed for today. So I know you'll have access to these slides. You have access to many of the resources already, and we thank you. And these are Tracy's wonderful young kids.
Yeah, those are my babies. Those are my masked up babies. I do see that multiple attendees are typing, so I think we're going to sit tight for a second and see what folks have to say.
So I see people saying, yeah, they'll be sharing resources with staff tonight. That's great.
Yeah. Oh, somebody thanked us for having the discussion, how to have discussions with children regarding the current environment. Oh, you're so welcome. There's so much more to be said about that. Feeling word posters. Oh,